You're listening to the Huddle Up Podcast with Chad Jensen and Zack Kelberman. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com and sound off. And now it's time to drop some knowledge.
Welcome in, everybody, to the Huddle Up Podcast, presented, as always, by Mile High Huddle and powered by Overtime Media. I'm your host, Chad Jensen, and with me, as always, is my partner in crime. You know him and love him as the lead NFL writer for Heavy.com. He is Zack Kelberman. Zack, it was normally, you expect Sundays to be quiet when it comes to covering the Broncos outside of the regular season, but it was a busy day today. We got to get down, and for our listeners, of course, they'll be checking this out Monday, but we're still here on Sunday, and dude, it's been a busy day.
I woke up this morning and I couldn't believe all the news that came out, Chad. I mean, injuries, Holland being waived, which came as a surprise to me, but then not really. And then, of course, the Broncos signed a cornerback. It was a very busy Sunday, and they have a very busy practice today. A lot to talk about there. But they got right back to work after that tough preseason loss.
A big roster move, some news about an injury we're going to get to today. So much to dive into. We're going to get to it here in just 1 second. First, a couple of quick reminders, especially for those of you who are new listeners. And by the way, we know each and every week this podcast is growing exponentially by about a 15 to 20% margin. So for those of you who are longtime listeners, you hear me say these type of things, just bear with us because the new listeners need the information, okay? Follow the show on Twitter, @HuddleUpPod. That's how you keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening with the show in real time. For those of you who are new listeners on YouTube, make sure you're subscribing. Don't forget to like. Don't forget to comment. And if you like what you hear, share it out. And the same goes for our new iTunes, Apple Podcast listeners. If you like what you hear, give us a creative review and a 5-star rating. Fantasy football fans, you got to listen up. Do you want to join the biggest NFL season-long tournament ever? Of course you do. If you love fantasy football, and we know you do, then you need to enter the $3.5 million Best Ball Championship on Draft. That's right, $3.5 million in real money. It is absolutely enormous. It's huge. It's season long, but there's no management. You just set it, you forget it. So instead of agonizing over your lineup every single Sunday, Draft does the analysis for you, gives you the most efficient, best odds to win your matchup lineup week in and week out. You do a draft, 16 weeks later, you could be a millionaire. Literally. It does not get any easier than that. It's the highest rated fantasy app, and it's available on the App Store and Google Play, or you can just go online to draft.com. For a limited time only, you can get a free entry into the Best Ball Championship when you make your first deposit, but you have to use our promo code HUDDLE. That's right, a free shot at $1 million just by using our promo code HUDDLE when you make your first deposit on Draft. Also, a phenomenal way to support the Huddle Up Podcast. Just search Draft in the App Store or go to draft.com and come play free with promo code HUDDLE. All right, Zach, let's start with the first thing that blasted across my news feed that I was getting blown up on as soon as I woke up this morning, and that is the fact that Theo Riddick, less than 1 week after he signed a 1-year deal worth $2.5 million, $1 million of that being fully guaranteed, the news breaks that he has fractured his shoulder. He's out 6 to 8 weeks.
Yeah, I was surprised that because they hid that injury very well. We didn't really have any inkling that he was injured coming out of that game, and it's awful because of the one Kevin Hogan pass, that Aaron pass that he had, it showed that Rich Scangarello had designs for Theo Riddick. And another injury for this Broncos team, Chad, and how much longer before we start to point the finger at all these injuries mounting up? I don't want to start blaming, I don't want to start putting on tinfoil hats, but, I mean, it's getting to be a pattern now. It's not a lower body one, but it's another blow to this Denver team, and something with this training regimen. Maybe it's the practices, maybe it's Fangio putting them in pads every day, but I'm starting to think they should pull back just a little bit.
Yeah, the bodies are just dropping. And for those of you who can think back to that Seattle game, you can go check out a tweet of mine at Chad and Jensen. You can see the play itself. But for those of you who can remember, bottom of the first quarter, Broncos are threatening in Seahawks territory. They're at like the 39. It's a 4th and 2. Fangio decides to go for it, of course, because it's preseason. Probably would have gone for it in the regular season, too, to be honest with you. But They go for it, and in that play, of course, Riddick starts out next to the quarterback in shotgun, and then he motions out to the far right, snap, and he runs just a quick slant, wide open, would have converted, except Hogan kind of sailed it upfield and too far inside, a little bit high too, where Riddick had to kind of lunge up and extend, and of course it was incomplete, and then he took a nice little pop there, a shot from that Seahawks DB, and the rest is history. So, Zach, I'm curious, this kind of ties into another kind of news point storyline from Sunday, the fact that Drew Lock had exclusive second-team reps. Now, of course, this is the first game or the first practice since that Seahawks game in which Lock showed some tremendous progress. And how much of Kevin Hogan, not just losing those second-team reps, but running scout team. Okay, it went Joe Flacco first team, Drew Lock second team, Brett Rippon third team, and running scout, simulating the 49ers is Kevin Hogan. Do you think the Theo Riddick injury, the fact that he was wildly inaccurate in his 2 or 3 possessions he had that night, bad pass led to an injured player, do you think that factored into the fact that he was running scout team?
I don't think it was any one play. I think it was just a collective failure. And he was very unimpressive to me, Chad. He just did not do enough to move the needle. He did not do enough to hold off Drew Lock and his arm talent. And that Seattle game was the definite, the 90% of the way. The Broncos, I think, made up their mind to have Drew Lock be the backup quarterback. And in practice, the extra 10% closed the door. Having Kevin Hogan be the third quarterback is one thing, but to then bump up Brett Rippon, who didn't play at all in the Seattle game, and now he's the number 3 over Kevin Hogan, that says a lot. And look, we've been pining for it for a while, Chad, and it wouldn't surprise me if maybe a couple days from now, maybe a week after a couple days after the 49ers game, if Kevin Hogan's no longer on the roster, but it has to happen soon. The longer he's around, he's just taking everything away from these quarterbacks.
He just doesn't present any upside, And again, it's a misnomer, excuse me, that he is like the experienced failsafe. It's like it was pointed out well by Brian Griese on the broadcast of the Seahawks game that, he's been in the league for a few years, but he's only got one career start. Okay, so that's all that separates him, really, from a guy like Drew Lock, from a guy like Brett Rippon. So I think the Broncos are kind of coming around to the idea that, look, we were looking for a clear separation of competency between Kevin Hogan and Drew Lock, and they're just not seeing it. Like, there was an inkling of it in that first game, in the Hall of Fame game, but the second game there against the Seahawks, it was nowhere to be found. And by the way, a quick tangent, a quick aside, I've seen some of the comments, some of the feedback on YouTube, giving you guys a little shout out. Some of you have taken exception to what Zach and I have said about Drew Lock's performance against the Seahawks. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. Zach, I don't think either one of us are saying that, it was some kind of like Aaron Rodgers-esque performance from Drew Lock. Nothing could be further from the truth. All we've said in that second game against the Seahawks is that Drew Lock showed progress. Now, I wrote an article, also published a video showcasing 5 different areas of his game in which he did show progress. And if you can't recognize that, then I don't know what to tell you. But Zach, most metrics, you can go back, watch the film, but most metrics in which a quarterback is analyzed, Drew Lock showed progress that game. And even Vic Fangio has said it now a couple of different occasions since the game ended.
I don't see how any Broncos fan can watch that game and not see progression from Drew Lock. I understand the reservations after the first game. I get it. No, he wasn't a bust, but he looked kind of shaky. But a lot of that was gone in the second game, Chad. His footwork was cleaner. He was a little more accurate. He had that it factor, threw his first touchdown, shut off his arm, threw with anticipation. Those are all things that the Broncos drafted him to be, and those are all things Kevin Hogan cannot do. But for any Broncos fan to still call him a bust or admit Elway made a mistake after a second I can't believe I'm reading those comments, Chad. I'm glad you brought it up. Broncos fans have been pining and pining and pining for a franchise quarterback prospect to be on the roster. And now when he finally is, they're complaining about him and they're holding him to an impossible standard. So the tantrum was a good word because the Broncos country has to relax. That sect of Broncos country who continues to overreact to Drew Lock for whatever reason, you have to calm down and understand what he's doing and appreciate the progression from week to week.
Well said. I think it was interesting as well. He was asked, Vic Fangio, following practice, whether or not the media, it's safe to say that Drew Lock is now the number 2 quarterback. He said, quote, "I'm not. You said we. I'm not. You can say it, but I'm not," close quote. In other words, they're not making any official change to the depth chart at this point. But as Mike Kliss wrote in his report of Sunday's training camp practice, the headline reads, "Practice reps say Drew Lock is the new number 2 quarterback." And here's why this is different than the other times in which Drew Lock has received like an increase in second-team reps. He had exclusive second-team reps on Sunday. And not only that, Kevin Hogan, again, I mentioned this, he didn't just get demoted to third team. He was running scout team, which to me says volumes in terms of how this coaching staff and likely also the front office right now is viewing the quarterback situation. Look, if you're looking for a fail-safe and your name is John Elway and Vic Fangio, you've already got your fail-safe. His name is Joe Flacco. Right. Everything else beyond that should be about maximizing the long-term potential and payoff of your 2 young, talented quarterbacks. And they each bring something different to the table. Obviously, Drew Lock is a very toolsy, traitsy quarterback, and Brett Rippon's skill set is more intangible and in between the ears in what he brings. But one thing that they both share is they were 4-year starters at their respective schools in college. And so the Broncos just need to hang their hat on that, Zach, and focus on getting these guys as many quality reps as possible, with especially a focus, obviously, on Drew Lock getting as many quality reps with the second team in practice and going against the second team in these preseason games.
I mean, it's not a bad lineup to have. You can do a lot worse than a 34-year-old who you think is entering his prime, who's been fairly injury resistant beyond, just last year. Then you have the big-armed, potential face of the franchise, the second-round pick. Then you have the heady Trevor Siemian type in Brett Rippon as your third quarterback. You can do a lot worse than that. Having Kevin Hogan there, he doesn't fit any of those packages. He's just taking up space. So Vic Fangio has started the process of phasing Kevin Hogan out. I am all for it. It should happen sooner than later. That's the way this business goes. Like you said, they need to give the reps, and while they can, as many as they can, to Drew Lock and Brett Rippon, who need them a lot more than a journeyman in Kevin Hogan.
Let's go back to the Theo Riddick issue. 6 to 8 weeks. Now, in real time, 4 weeks from now, the Broncos are going to be at the regular season opener. So the soonest he's expected back, based on this prognosis, is 2.5, maybe 3 games into the regular season, a full month possibly into the regular season. So that being the case, Zach, do you see any circumstance in which the Broncos go, you know what, we tried, we're on the hook for that $1 million, but we got to make hay while the sun's shining. Devontae Booker makes the roster. Philip Lindsay, Royce Freeman, obviously, they're going to have to carry a fullback. I mean, if you think about this, you got the injury to both Andy Janovich and now Theo Riddick. Those 2 injuries are really throwing the roster math off kilter big time, because now on the fullback side, the Broncos, worst case scenario, we're going to carry 3 running backs and a fullback. So all in 4 guys. But now with 2 guys who they fully intended on making this roster being injured and to start the regular season, now they have to decide whether they want to carry as many as 5, even 6 total running backs, because if not, here's your options. For example, Andy Janovich injured, Theo Riddick injured. Neither one of them are eligible for PUP because they participated during a training camp practice. That immediately writes them off the PUP possibility. They're both eligible to be placed on injured reserve because every NFL team can bring 2 players back off injured reserve during the regular season, but they have to wait 8 weeks. So unless you were willing to, roll the dice and put Andy Janovich on injured reserve, bring him back halfway through the season, meanwhile you're going to roster the rookie George Aston, it's kind of a weird situation. What do you do? Here's what I think is going to happen, Zach. I think the Broncos are going to end up carrying 4 running backs, and I think they're going to cut George Aston and put him on the practice squad and see how the first week or 2 goes. And in terms of fullback duties, while Andy Janovich is injured, and I'm talking regular season here, I think they'll ask a tight end to play some H-back and do some lead blocking and just try and get by the skin of their teeth while Janovich heals, because you can't carry 2 fullbacks on the active roster, and you don't want to put, at the same time, Andy Janovich as your only other alternative would be to put Andy Janovich on injured reserve, which means you're waiting 8 games before you get him back.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Chad. I don't think Janovich will be out that long personally, knowing how tough he is and how strong he is. I would not be surprised to see him back by week 2, and you can get by for a couple weeks without a fullback. Like you said, a tight end in that spot, maybe like Hireman as a blocker would work just fine. And in terms of Theo Riddick, he's a little more expendable to me. It's going to come down to how much the Broncos really value him. They gave him a $1 million guarantee in his contract. They paid him a fair amount, which suggests they want him on the 53-man roster. But now this injury does change things. This is by far a prime opportunity for Devontae Booker. Next couple weeks in the preseason, it can determine whether he's going to have a job in Denver or whether Theo Riddick's going to have a job. It's still, in my opinion, going to be one or the other. You don't need both. And Phillip Lindsay and Royce Freeman. It's going to be too much of the same position. I would not be surprised if Booker impresses over the course of the next couple games. They cut Theo Riddick and it's a tough break for them, figuratively and literally.
I'm actually in full agreement with you on this. It might sound controversial or like some kind of a hot take, but let us just put it this way to our great listeners. Don't be surprised if the Broncos end up, maybe against their own will, but due to, an unrelenting, pitiless roster math, having to cut bait with Theo Riddick, because they're just in an awkward situation now with also a fullback being injured. How many running backs can you justify carrying? It's either that or just be willing to be without a couple guys for 8 full weeks of the regular season, which, if you're going to pay $1 million to Theo Riddick and you do want him no matter what, you don't want him missing as many as 6 games that he wouldn't otherwise have to if you hadn't put him on IR. So it's a situation to monitor. It's definitely a tricky, touchy situation that the Broncos are now dealing with, and we'll see how it continues to unfold. Now, a couple other big items that we got to get to in today's show that occurred on Sunday. We'll get to them here in just a second. First, we got to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
This is the Overtime Podcast Network.
All right, Zach, we got to touch on and bid adieu and farewell and happy trails to Mr. Jeff Holland, who was waived by the Denver Broncos on Sunday. The corresponding roster move was the team signed Rashard Kazi. I'm not sure. I think that's how you pronounce his name. A cornerback, undrafted rookie cornerback, who they got a good look at in the Atlanta game, in the Hall of Fame game. The Falcons waived him, and so they signed him to replace Holland. Now, after practice on Sunday, let me just read what Vic Fangio had to say really quickly about the Jeff Holland transaction, and then I'll serve this over to you. He said, quote, "I like the way Malik has played. We like him a lot, but also," of course talking about Malik Reed, "we like him a lot, but also we had 8 guys there at outside linebacker. We need some guys at other positions. That was where we had the most guys stacked up to make it work," close quote. So, in other words, the great performance through 2 preseason games of Malik Reed, in which he's tallied a sack in each game, multiple pressures, kind of marginalized Jeff Holland, made him expendable. Your thoughts, Zach, on the Denver Broncos parting ways with Holland, who showed so much promise as an undrafted rookie last year, but simply hasn't been able to make any hay under Vic Fangio?
It was surprising to me, Chad, and not surprising at the same time. It's surprising because this is a guy, like you said, had great breakout potential. He looked really good under Vance Joseph, and you expected him to take that leap. One of the guys, if anyone, under Vic Fangio, a guy who coached outside linebackers, and it just never materialized. From what I saw from him on the field, when he was on the field this preseason, he was pretty bad in run support. He didn't get much pressure, and as soon as Malik Reed came on the field, Chad, it was a whole different thing. Night and day difference, and he caused more pressure, and Fangio, he has to feel more confident going with him as a direct backup. I think it's surprising that he got cut at this stage of the summer. I mean, it's still August 11th. It doesn't happen to final cuts. But obviously that he didn't show well on film, and Fangio believes that he's not going to progress this season, and I'm happy he's giving Malik Reed a shot. He was a guy I really liked coming out as an undrafted free agent, and he's just that next gem that John Elway unearthed as an undrafted guy.
So, of course, we know it's going to be Von Miller, Bradley Chubb, and traditionally most NFL teams are going to carry 4 outside linebackers. There is the odd year. The Broncos have done so at times under John Elway where they'll carry 5. But I think they're hedging against just going with 4 in 2019. So you got Bradley Chubb, Von Miller. There's 2. Sounds like Dakota Watson, and by virtue of his contract and the fact that they gave up a 5th-round pick to get him in the draft, he takes up that 3rd spot. Obviously, the leader in the clubhouse for the 4th is going to be Malik Reed. But with Jeff Holland gone, the other guys who factor in, you got Justin Hollins, rookie 5th-rounder, who's playing off-ball and edge, Aaron Wallace, Ahmad Gooden, and let me see if I'm missing anybody here. I think that pretty much covers it. So it sounds like Malik Reed, barring an immense regression in these final 3 preseason games, he's making this 53, Zach.
I don't see how he wouldn't make the 53, Chad. And you don't need many linebackers beyond that. I mean, you have a future Hall of Famer in Von Miller. You have Bradley Chubb, who's going to be an all-pro soon. And you have a young guy and Malik Reed, who's looked really good, a developmental guy for Vic Fangio. My thing is, though, with Hollins, is he outside linebacker? Is he inside linebacker? I'd rather the Broncos nail that down now before moving forward. With all these changes, Chad, at outside and inside, let's pick one position for that guy. But outside, though, with the other 3, I think they're in good shape still.
Yeah, and that's a tough thing that they're asking a rookie to manage, learning and playing 2 positions as a rookie. It obviously was a disaster for DeMarcus Walker back in 2017. This is a different coaching staff that prioritizes teaching in a much more passionate way than the previous regime did. So there is that aspect, and obviously Justin Hollins and DeMarcus Walker are 2 different human beings with different character and everything that goes along with that. So it's not ideal to ask him to learn 2. So far, I think he's, I don't know, just based on 2 preseason games, I think he's basically treading water. I can't think off the top of my head of Justin Hollins making any kind of a big impact play. And by that I mean, open field tackle, quarterback sack, forcing a turnover. He's kind of been average. Yeah, I mean, average. Yes. So what's been your take so far on Hollins through a couple of preseason games?
I agree with you. I really haven't noticed him in a good way or a bad way. He's just another player on the roster right now. And I think where he hurts is 2 of the Broncos starting inside linebackers are injured. So who is he leaning on in practice on the field? I mean, it's tough for a guy learning 2 spots. And I believe, based on what I saw in his film anyway, that he's a better outside linebacker, a better pass rusher than having him move to off-ball. But with all the injuries, Chad, it's so tough. Hopefully he progresses, but he's looking like way more of a developmental guy and a project guy than I think the Broncos would have hoped for initially.
Speaking of off-ball linebacker, the Denver Broncos made a decision on Sunday. Well, who knows when they made the decision. They executed the decision on Sunday in which they are taking safety Jamal Carter, and they're going to play him for now exclusively at off-ball linebacker. Now, this isn't that big of a departure for Carter because as a strong safety, he's got plenty of experience playing in the box as a dime backer. But there's a big difference between, covering a tight end in a nickel package, on 3rd down, and actually being an off-ball linebacker on 1st and 2nd down where you are pursuing the run, you're contending with, offensive tackles, guards, centers, big 300-pounders. You have to be able to stack, you got to be able to shed, and still find a way to get to the ball carrier. Now, the concern with Carter, and I'm not saying I am concerned, but the concern is the fact that he's only 215 pounds. Now, I can think back to when most fans can remember Wesley Woodyard. He was brought in as an undrafted rookie. I think it was 08, might have been 09. And he was really light. He was a converted defensive back himself. He eventually, beefed up and put on weight and got up into the 230s, if I recall correctly. But at 215 pounds, you can be ragdolled by these 300-pounders at the point of attack. So for me, Zach, that's the only real concern with Carter. However, I do like he's a very physical player. I think there's a chance he could really succeed here, but it's probably now his best shot at the roster because he was another guy that was kind of fading into the background with this safety competition.
And that's exactly what his reasoning was, reportedly, for the switch, was he thought he had a better chance of making the 53 as an inside linebacker versus a safety. I happen to think he's right, considering all the inconsistency. This puts a lot of pressure, though, on Sua Cravens, who's kind of like the same player, a tweener. And Jamal Carter said he wants to be a Mark Barron type, a Dayon Buchanan type, a dime backer. He has the physicality, like you mentioned, Chad. He has the athleticism. He's good on special teams. He can really work his way the next couple of weeks here. And if Sua Cravens kind of fades in the background, I believe he can push his way onto the roster, considering all these injuries. I happen to be a big fan of Jamal Carter. I know you are, too. I think the Broncos missed his presence to some extent last year, and he makes them a better team. So I like this move all around. If they can get a Mark Barron type to go in this Vic Fangio defense, I'm all for it.
I mean, it will definitely be interesting to see how this thing shakes out because what we've talked about it on the podcast, Nick Kendall has pointed it out on, I think, both preseason games so far, but what the Broncos off-ball linebacker core appears to be missing top down, from Todd Davis all the way down to the last guy, is that twitchy athleticism and an ability to cover in short areas. And you'd think that with all those years of playing defensive back, being Jamal Carter, that some coverage ability would be the one leg up a guy like him would have joining that linebacker core. And I mean, his opportunity at safety just drying up. And a lot of that, too, has to do with the fact that the Broncos are intent on playing Kareem Jackson pretty exclusively at safety. Now, who knows how it could change in-game, but in terms of roster math, Kareem Jackson is very much a safety. So when you throw in there Justin Simmons, you got Will Parks, you got Kareem Jackson, there's three guys right there. There's a chance they could carry as many as 5 safeties, but I'm thinking they're going to try, especially with what's going on the offensive side of the ball, the injuries there, and with what's going on at linebacker too, they're going to try and stick with 4, which right now, if they stick with 4, that next guy's probably going to be Sua Cravens, maybe DeMonte Thomas. So for Carter, this is his best shot.
I think for that fourth guy, Chad, you very good point. If they have to go heavy elsewhere, they're going to want that fourth guy to play both spots. They can get an inside linebacker and a safety in one player, and they can save a roster spot at both areas. I think they would rather go with that. So that's why I'm saying Jamal Carter versus Sua Cravens. If he has a good couple weeks, Carter now fully healthy and committed to a new position and apparently motivated, I think he has a good chance of pushing forward. I am particularly a fan of his, so I think he has a good chance in Fangio's system.
It will be fun to see how it works out, and he's still got a lot of daylight left to prove himself. 3 full preseason games until any decisions are made in terms of formulating the final 53. So we'll see how he looks. And, of course, the Broncos are going to get the San Francisco 49ers in joint training camp practice sessions this week before the game on Saturday, I believe this one is. So it'll be fun to see how it shakes out. But in the meantime, that's going to do it for today's episode of the Huddle Up Podcast. Zach and I, stay tuned for this. We have some fun things cooking, some different ideas we're working on. We're going to roll out this week at some point in which we are going to be a lot more active on YouTube and kind of compound what we're doing here with the podcast with some additional content for you, our listeners and viewers on YouTube. So stay tuned for that. Some cool things coming this week. More information is going to come out, so just stay tuned. But also make sure you're following the show on Twitter at HuddleUpPod. That's how you stay in touch with us on a day-to-day. You can find my partner Zack Kelberman on Twitter at KelbermanNFL, myself at Chad and Jensen. Stay tuned. We'll be back tomorrow with a fresh podcast. For Zack Kelberman, I'm Chad Jensen. We'll talk to you then.
You've been listening to the Huddle Up Podcast. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com to keep the conversation going.